Hey everyone, I know it's been a while since I posted something on YouTube. I wanted to come back and get back into React. So today I'm going to show you how we can use React with Redux. So we're going to just go over how to set that up, just the setup of the React and Redux together and how we can connect them. And we're just going to create a simple little app, just a counter app to add or subtract to the count, and show you how we can use the Redux store to store that state. So let's jump right into Visual Studio Code and let's get started. So I have an empty project folder here, and I'm going to install the React library here. So I'm going to do npx create React app, and then I'm going to just do dot to install in the current directory. So this is going to take a couple minutes, and I'm just going to fast forward through this. Alright, so we have React installed. I'm going to go ahead and install Redux and React Redux libraries. So those are two separate libraries that we need to get this working. So I'm going to do npm I and then Redux and then React Redux. And what we're going to do here is we're going to get rid of this boilerplate React that we get. So I'm going to get rid of this app.js, anything related with that. And we'll create our own components. Okay, so we'll leave index.js and index.css. Okay, so we have React and Redux and React Redux installed. And one more thing I'm going to show you guys is how to get the Redux dev tools working. So I'm going to install the Redux dev tools as a dev dependency. So we're going to do Redux dev tools extension. And if you don't have the Redux dev tools Chrome extension installed, you'll want to install that so that this will work with it. So what we're going to do here is set up our folder structure. So in React, we usually have a components folder that contains all of our components. And then for the Redux, I usually like to keep everything in a store directory. And then, so a good practice to follow is to create containers for your components anytime you have a Redux application state being injected into your component, React component. And we'll go over and I'll show you guys an example of all this, and we'll go into detail of that. So I'm just going to create our component here, and it's just going to be main.jsx, and just set this up, create the function, return a div, and then we're going to set up two buttons here. So we're going to export default this, and then we're going to set up two buttons. So we're going to have an add count and a subtract count. And those buttons won't really do anything right now, but for now, and then we're going to have a p tag with just hard-coded of 0. This is where we'll pass in some data from the Redux store and show the count here. So I'm going to run the npm run start command to start the React dev server. Just make sure, so we're going to get an error probably because in our index.js it's expecting app. So we're going to use main. Okay, and then replace this with main. Alright, so I'm going to refresh this, and you can see here we have our component set up, and in our index.js I'm going to add a margin of 20 pixels. Make sure that looks, yeah, that looks better. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to set up our Redux store. So before we pass in any state, we need to set up the Redux store. So let's set that up. So we're going to create a file here called store.js. This is where all this state will be passed into the store. So the way we create the state in Redux is we have a reducers directory. The reducers are just functions which take an initial state and then they take an action as a parameter. So so for our sample app, which is just a counter app, I'm going to call this reducer count reducer. I like to name my reducers related to context. So this is just going to be a function called count reducer. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and export this. Okay. So this is going to have a state as the first parameter with a default value of 0, since that's what we're going to store for the count. And it's going to take in an action parameter. Alright, so this action is usually a object. And in the object contains a key of type. This type lets us, the reducer, know based on what case do we update the state. Which state do we want to update? So in our example, we have just a single state, which is just a counter, which is 0 for now. So what we would want to do is add or subtract. So in our case, we would have two actions, would be add count. So we could name this as add count. And then what we would do is return a new state where we add 1 to it. Okay, and usually the best practice here is to keep these in a separate directory called action types. And then I'm going to create a file called count types. Probably not the best name for it, but it'll do for now. And I'm going to say, I don't like the name count types. I'm going to do like count action types. Let's just keep that. So add count is equal to add count, and then I believe we also mentioned subtract. So we're just going to go ahead and add this. All right, and we need to go ahead and export these. Okay, so what we can do here, instead of hard coding the case statements, we can import them from our action types. And so here we'll have an add count and subtract count. So I like to have for each reducer, I like to have an action types file created for it, specific to it. So these action types will be used to determine what state to change. And also there is another case. So in order to get this state to be updated, we need to create an action. So an action is nothing but a function that gets dispatched. So in Redux there's a function called dispatch, which will trigger an update to the Redux store. Alright, so in action, we're going to say count action.js. And these are just functions. So we would do add count, and it returns an object. So remember when I mentioned action and then action.type? Well, this is where the action is coming in from. So we would do type, and we're going to import the action types. So we would do add count and subtract count. Okay, so here all we're going to simply do is return the type of add count. So usually if you're trying to, update some data from text input or something like that, best practice would be to do a payload and then some data in here passed in from the user input, or what we would pass in from the component. So it would be like this. We would expect a parameter of data and then pass it in as an argument and then pass it here, and it would come to the reducer, and we could do like action.payload and it would update the state to whatever action.payload was if it was a number. But in this case, we're just going to increment it by 1 or decrement it by 1. So we don't need a payload here. Okay, so we're going to do function subtract count. And let me get rid of that data parameter. Okay, and then we're going to do return type subtract count. Alright, so all we need to do here is just export these functions. And these functions are what updates the state, so we use this directly in our component. Okay, so we have our action, we have our reducer setup, and we have the action type setup. So now we need to set up the store. So I'm going to import from the React Redux library, I believe. Let me make sure that's correct. Creates, nope, not the React, it's just Redux. It's going to be create store, and then there's another function called combine reducers that we need. It's okay. So combine reducers lets you contain multiple reducers in that single object. So what we're going to have is a root reducer, and then call the function combine reducers, and it's going to take in an object. So here, however many reducers you have, we're going to import them. So I believe we called this count reducer from reducers count reducer. And then it's going to be a key value pair. So the key can be called anything, and that's whatever you want to be passed down into your component. So how you want to access a state. So I'm just going to do this simply as count because that's what it holds. It's just a count. And then count reducer. Okay, so the root reducer is there. And now we're going to set up our store. So we're going to create a variable for the store. We're going to say create store root, and pass in the root reducer. Then let's just export default the store. Cool, so we have the store set up now. And then I'll show you how to set up the dev tools at the very end. So what we're going to do next is in the index.js, in order to pass down the store, we need to import the store here. Oh, a store. And then we also need to import something from the Redux library. I believe it's Redux. I think it's actually React Redux, which is the provider. Yeah. The provider will pass down the store. So provider store. There we go. And something like, and then what we do is we contain our component in here. And yep, so that's it here. And what we need to do now is, I mentioned the containers. So I like to create a container for each component that is going to contain Redux state. So I'm going to create a main container.js. The reason for this is I like to keep the view part of this and the data that it retrieves separated from the data that's going to be injected into the component. All right, that's going to be passed down into the component is probably what better wording. So in the container, what we're going to do is import from React Redux a function called connect. This will connect your Redux state to your React component, and then we're going to also import the main component from the components main. All right, so this we are going to do is export default connect. Okay, and then this, okay, so what we're doing here, connect here takes in two parameters. We usually pass down map state to props and map dispatch to props. Now let me explain that. So this is how your state will get passed down into your component. So any state that we have, so in this case count, we can pass it down to our main component. So it's a key value pair, so we're going to say count, and we have direct access. So what do you what I'm trying to so what's inside of state? Well, inside of state is this right here. Whatever is contained in this object will be inside of state. All right, so we have state.count, and then I also mentioned map dispatch to props, and this takes in dispatch, and same thing returns an object. So any actions, anything that you want to update the Redux store is what you pass into dispatch. And in the connect function, the first argument we pass in is map state to props, and the second one will be map dispatch to props. Okay, we'll add into the dispatch afterwards. Let's just get the state working. So now in our index.js, instead of including main, what we will include is the container. So it would be main container. Cool. So now we don't need this index.js. And in our main, we usually pass in props like this. I'm just going to destructure it. So to destructure, I'm going to get a count variable, which is going to be the state right here. And I'm going to, instead of hard coding to 0, I'm going to set it to the variable as count. I can't type. Okay. So, and one thing I forgot to do, you can see right here in the lint warning, is in the reducer, I forgot to add a default case, which is very important to have. We're just going to simply return the state. All right. So now, well, we can't really tell. So I'm going to change this initial state to 1 so that you guys can see that the state is actually being passed down. So you see right here, the initial state is actually being passed down from the Redux store, which is good. We have our Redux application state connected to our main component right here. So what we want to do now is set up these actions so that we can add and subtract a count to update this state in the store. So the way we can do that is in our container, we are going to import the actions that we created in our actions directory. So we have store, actions, count action. And then we're going to have an add count and subtract count. And then what we're going to do here is create a key of add count. This is going to be a function that gets called, and we're going to dispatch the action of add count, which will then go to the count reducer, and it will find this case and then update the state. All right, same thing with the subtract. Cool. So we have subtract count and add count, and in our reducer we only added the case for add count, so I'm going to add the case for subtract count. Oh, this should be minus. Cool. So now in our main component, we're going to add the properties of add count and subtract count. Okay, so we're going to have some on-click events here. We're going to say add count. And then same thing here. We're going to have subtract count. Cool. So now if I come here, let me refresh this. So you can see here that the Redux state is getting updated, and the component is the one that is driving the update, and it's getting the proper value. So one thing I want to show you now is the Redux dev tools, which is really useful for debugging. So you can see here it says no store found. So in our store.js, we're going to include the library that we installed, which was Redux DevTools extension, and we're going to do compose with DevTools. So this is a function that we're going to pass down and call here. Compose with DevTools. Now I'm going to refresh this. Okay, so you see here now that it's connected to our React app, you can see here that the state is here, and if I hit add count, you see that the add count action gets recorded here, and our state is now updated to 1. Same thing with subtract count. Cool. So that's what I wanted to show you. I want to show you one more thing. If you guys want to see, is how do we pass in actual data to our component with the payload that example that I showed you earlier. So what I'm going to do here is just have an input of type text. Okay, and the value is just going to be empty for now. Actually, I'm not going to even put a value. Okay, so we have the input. Okay, so what if we wanted to update the state of this and then also store the state? So what we would do is I'm just going to add it to the count reducer. Actually, I'm going to create a new reducer so you guys can see what it looks like with multiple reducers. So we're going to just say input reducer for this example. Create a new function called input reducer. And then we're going to have a switch statement. Okay, so we need to pass in the initial state for this input, which will be empty string. And then you're going to have the action. And then we're going to do switch on the action.type. And let's create a action type. And I'm just going to create a new file here called input action types.js. And then another way we could export is export const. And then I'm going to create a input update input. Should be all caps. Update input. Okay, and then I'm going to import that here. Action types, input, update input. I'm going to do case, update input, and then so we would pass in something into the action, some data of what the value was typed in. So what we would do is simply return action.payload. So we would be returning a new version of the state, and yeah. So what are we going to do? I need to add the default state. When it comes to objects and arrays in the reducer, you'll want to look up something called immutability, where we don't modify the existing state and we actually create new arrays and new objects that we return whenever we're updating the state. So if you want to look into that, I'm going to create, more in-depth tutorials on React Redux, definitely, and also include a backend in the future. So stay tuned for those, and I'll go into detail where I show those type of examples in those projects. This is just so simple. I just wanted to show this simple basic setup. So here, I'm just going to do return state, export default, input reducer. All right, so in the store, we need to include this, import input reducer from reducers, input reducer, and I'm just going to call this input value from the input reducer. And if we come back to the main container, all we need to do here is just say input value state.input value. All right, hopefully this is making sense. So now we have an input value, and I'm going to pass that input value into a value here so that now it becomes a controlled input. So input value. Now obviously you won't be able to see anything, it's just an empty string. But if you see in the Redux dev tools, you should be able to see in the state that we have input value now set up. So now let's handle the onChange. So if we wanted to change, whenever we change this, we want to update the state. So in the actions, let's create a input action. Let's create a function called update input, return type, and then I'm going to import the action types. And then we're going to do update input. So the type would be update input, and then our payload would be input value is what we're expecting, and then it would just be input value. Let's export this. Cool, so now we have our action set up, and then in the main container we could import this action. Input, okay. Update input. So I'm going to say update input, dispatch, update input. So now here we're actually expecting a value to be passed in. So here we'll be passing in the input value. And I'm just going to take away those parentheses, they're not needed. And then we'll pass that into here. Okay, so I know these are really silly examples, but hopefully they drive the understanding of how this is all connected. So we pass in the action called update input. So now we can have an onChange event, and we do update input. So this is going to be event. So in the update input, we're going to pass in e.target.value. All right. So what we want to do here is do test. So you see, oh, okay. So it says that we called the action, but the actual state did not get updated. So let's look at the reducer real fast. Oh, all right. So the mistake I made here is I put in input reducer in the input action. Oh man, the auto fill sometimes messes up. Okay. So I don't know why this was oh yeah, because it was auto filled, so that's why it was imported. All right, so let's refresh that. Let's try this now. So you see now test is a value that will be stored in the state right here. So each character you type in will cause a dispatch to occur to the Redux store. I just wanted to drive the point that this is how you can update the store, several methods. So you can do add count, subtract count, input There's many examples that I will eventually show you guys in different projects. And for the next couple of videos, I would expect that I will be putting out is the React Redux related videos. So yeah, guys, that's really it. If you guys like this content and you enjoyed and you learned something from it, please consider liking and subscribing. Also, I wanted to mention thank you guys so much for reaching over 500 subscribers. That is incredible for me. I did not even expect that to happen. I just want to keep going, and I want to post more videos more frequently, and I just want to thank you guys for all the support. So see you guys next time. We'll create a React Redux app where we implement a form, and I hope you guys to see you there in that video. So thank you. See you next time. Bye bye.